Hi, welcome to another episode of our FIU course podcast, the Interfaiths podcast. We're very honored to have Professor Abdullah, who's joining us here. Ibrahim, I'm sorry.
No problem.
Ibrahim Al-Marashi, who is joining us for an AI conference that we're doing right now. And so I'll let him introduce himself and talk a little bit about a very, very interesting family history that's brought him to where he's at today.
Yeah, so I'm Ibrahim Al-Marashi. I teach history in San Diego, and currently I'm based, I also teach in Madrid and occasionally teach courses in Rome and Milan, and I'm going to be teaching a class called The Problem of God in Florence.
Oh, nice. Okay.
But otherwise, in terms of my family history, it's a National Geographic documentary, more or less. Yeah. The easy answer, where both my sides of the family have origins from, is in Najaf. But one side of the family, which we'll talk about today, has an East African connection. And the other, in terms of interfaith, is the other side of my family is half Christian and half Muslim. So this is a subject that's not theoretical for me. It's a subject that I live.
So talk to us about, so your family is originally from Najaf.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. How did they make their way, or why did they make their way to East Africa?
So this is my father's side of the family. Right. So when my grandfather, when he was studying to be a cleric in Najaf, this was during the eventual fall of the Ottoman Empire, when it made its alliance in World War I with the Central Powers. So in the 1920s, there was this uprising in Iraq. It was the beginning of what was then called the Iraqi insurgency in the 1920s, and it was against the British. And my grandfather was one of those people who lived within Iraq and fought the British. So he was there during a transition period when the Ottoman Empire had just come collapsing, and the British were replacing Iraq with a mandate, which was a League of Nations political entity, which they would control. It was a colony all but in name. And so apparently, my grandfather picked up a rifle, tried to fight the British, wasn't very good. He was incarcerated, was able to escape. And the 1920s was the age of the passport, because there was if you remember during the pandemic, how we needed this piece of paper to travel internationally. Exactly. It was introduced actually during the Spanish flu, or the Great Influenza pandemic of 1918. So it's an interesting moment when I was going through my father's belongings, and I found my grandfather's passport. And the passport was a passport of the Persian Empire. That's what it was called when he got it, when he had to leave, when he was fleeing the British. And he needed that because Iran in those days kind of worked like the Vatican, where they had like a record of where there was a need for a cleric. So just like, the Catholic Church would do that. My grandfather was told there's a need for a cleric in this island called Zanzibar. And that's how he ended up in Zanzibar, to be a Jafari Athnashari Shia cleric on the island, and that's where my father was born in 1935.
Interesting, yeah. So from the part of the Khoja lore is that there were actually some Khojas that actually had gone for pilgrimage to Najaf, and they had met some Ayatollahs, and they were impressed to see that they were they knew something about Shiism, but they didn't know much about Shiism. And so then your grandfather was then tasked to go and to teach them about the tradition. And so that's kind of part of this transition from their own religious traditions, which was a combination of Hinduism and then also Sunni and Shia Islam, into kind of more sort of mainstream Shia Islam. So teaching them in terms of like Shia law, fiqh, and then also starting this interesting transition that has developed until today, which is the khums, and sort of how to be able to transfer funds to the Ayatollahs and kind of the authority that brings. So that's very interesting. So your family was in Zanzibar for a while. They're no longer in Zanzibar. What happened?
So, the beginning, my father and his brothers, my grandmother died when my father was only a child during childbirth. So my father and his brothers all wanted to go into medicine to improve the health sector in Zanzibar. And in those days, you went to India to study medicine. This was during the non-aligned movement, and the government of India was offering scholarships in East Africa. So my father went to go study medicine in Madras and Bombay, and then eventually he made his way to London School of Tropical Hygiene and Medicine, this great imperial center to where the British kind of managed their empire. So of course Zanzibar by this time, is more or less a British domain. Basically. And while he was studying, while he was abroad in the UK, of course, there was an upheaval in Zanzibar, and anyone kind of associated with the kind of intermediate class on behalf of the British Empire had to flee. And so my grandfather's family, including my grandfather, had to leave Zanzibar. And so their mission of coming back to Zanzibar and helping the island's public health sector, of course, never materialized. They never had a choice. And my grandfather died along the journey, and so he's buried by Mount Kilimanjaro in this town called Arusha. Of course. And I visited his grave in the year 2000, and my father never went to Zanzibar until the year 2000 as well. It was during that trip when I was at the University of Oxford, I got a scholarship where I could take my father and myself. We both went to Zanzibar. Okay. And so not really since maybe late 1950s, there was a span of about 50 years between the last time he left Zanzibar with a boat. He took a boat to India. And in the year 2000, he flew back for the first time.
Oh, wow. Interesting. And so the grave in Arusha, is that in the Khoja cemetery? It's
in the Khoja cemetery, Okay. And this is the amazing thing about when we went on that trip. It wasn't just to Zanzibar. Yeah. It was really a trip about the Khoja networks in East Africa. Okay. Because the minute we landed in Dar es Salaam, there were members of the Khoja community to pick us up from the airport, host us, and help us recreate the past. So that we went, it was the same in Dar es Salaam, the same in Arusha, in Zanzibar itself, of course, and then in Mombasa. Oh, wow. And they helped my father recreate his past. It's quite interesting. Oh, that's amazing. And the minute we arrived in the airport, they took care of us. It really wasn't just my grandfather and my father's history. It was really just how impressive the Khoja network was, that they treated him like royalty when he came back.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think like even within, because I worked a lot on Khoja heritage and Khoja history and stuff like that, and like your family is kind of like a big legend. They're the Aghas, like the
Agha Hassan.
Agha Hassan.
Exactly, that's how he was referred to.
So it's a very important part of the Khoja identity that they feel that they have. They're tremendously indebted to your family for being able to teach them about Islam and the tradition. So that's interesting. I mean, so as you were going through this journey into the past, what are some of the unique things that you sort of observed about your family that you were like, okay, well, this is really interesting. This kind of connects to something that I knew or I grew up with, or a perspective.
I grew up with the story of my father from Zanzibar, who, when he went to India, the student organization he joined was the Pan-African Student Organization. Right. This is a father who always used to told me in 1956, he sent his shoe to Prime Minister Eden for the Suez Canal crisis and Britain's role in, work colluding with Israel and France. So he always spoke of the British presence in Zanzibar as one of, an imperial presence. Right. What was interesting was the minute we got off the ferry from Dar es Salaam to Zanzibar, and he looked at the island, and the first thing he said was, "I wish the British never left." And so that was the first interesting dynamic that, we were always raised with a father who, told us about all his his life as an anti-colonial resistance to the British, and the minute he comes there, he says the British should have never left.
So why did he say that?
Because in his opinion, it wasn't the island he remembered of the 50s. It had declined. It had fallen apart in his eyes. And so basically he remembers the pristine imperial past, and this is what he held on to when he went there, and it was kind of a disappointment for him. It was the way to our family house, he didn't remember. It was, again, the local Khojas had to show them, this is your family house, this is where your grandfather used to give his sermons from. And so it was more of learning of the Zanzibar he left in the 1950s, and it just never matched his connection. It was interesting hearing him speak Swahili for the first time, and how he was struggling with the words and so on and so forth. So I think that those were the most surprising elements of coming back to Zanzibar. And in that trip in the year 2000.
Yeah, I mean, it's changed a lot since then. I think even when I was growing up, and I used to go back with my mother, Zanzibar, in that time, like that was like sort of the 90s when I was younger, it had completely fallen apart. I mean, because like just basically what had happened is that you had the revolution that took place, and so the entire it was a very cosmopolitan society, and so many of the groups had left. Basically, they're forced out. And it was just there are a couple of different things. Like one is that just even the walls and everything in Zanzibar are made of coral stone, and the coral stone itself has to be maintained in a certain way as the monsoons come through. And so if it's not properly plastered on a regular basis and cleaned, like the entire thing just falls down. And so one of the main buildings, which is the palace, it was known as Beit al-Ajaib. So Beit al-Ajaib collapsed. Like about 10 years ago, the entire half of the wing just completely collapsed.
That's a tragedy.
So it had been not been properly maintained, and then what ended up happening is that the Omani government came and stepped in and helped to rebuild, and then interestingly enough, the AKD and the Aga Khan Development Network has also now kind of rebuilt, especially the ferry port in sort of that area. So it's starting to come back sort of economically, but it was for decades. Because basically it was so reliant on clove exports. And what had happened is that then it was kind of mass producing cloves, and it was they connected kind of basically the East Indies to sort of global markets, and then basically the small quantity that Zanzibar was able to produce was not sufficient, and you were able to kind of do clove production all over the world. And so it was just this one major crop basically, and monocrop exactly. And they try to control it by using, also it went through the socialist phase, so they tried to control the production of it, and then that also of course failed as well, right? So there's a lot of just the entire sort of island essentially. When I was going there, when I was growing up, it looked like it was just kind of like some sort of bomb had hit it or something like that. It was just very, very sad situation.
It was, it was very sad.
It was a very sad, exactly. And then also the way that it was described, because what you would see is that in the old city as well, there are these benches called baraza. And so when they were growing up, people were everywhere. I mean, if you go to the city center, the Stone Town now, it feels kind of deserted in a way.
I see,
right? But at that time, I mean, every building was full of people. People would sit on the stone benches. In the evenings, they would talk to each other. I mean, it was a whole...
Oh, yeah, we didn't
the culture.
see that.
The culture was completely different at that point, And the remarkable thing is also that like your father, and then my uncles and aunts and stuff like that, they all spoke English perfectly almost, right? Which is quite remarkable. So just the level of integration, cosmopolitanism that existed at that time also sort of was gone as well. So and people used to say that it used to be that it was the capital of the Omani Empire in the 19th century.
Yeah,
it was extremely wealthy.
Yeah,
I mean, it was like the crown jewel of the Omani Empire. And imagine that, they just transferred the capital there.
Yeah.
So how much money sort of was coming in and out of there. So it's interesting kind of thinking about that history. So how did your family history take you to where you are today in your own, sort of intellectual journey and your own personal identity?
So, it's quite interesting that, of course, when you come from Zanzibar, first of all, it's a great teaching
Yes.
experience. And so, because I really stress to my students that these categories we use, such as the Middle East or East Africa, we kind of create containers that deny us the chance of looking at the linkages, or just how these regions are more or less Cold War figments of our imaginations, whereas phenomena such as the monsoon winds bring these regions together in ways that is natural, as the environment does one thing and our geopolitics does another. And so I love telling that story from Najaf. Both my father and, of course, my father's neighbor, Farrokh Bulsara, ended up in the UK. And there they learned the politics of, empire and the metropole. And, of course, Farrokh Bulsara won't resonate, but I love showing him the picture because Farrokh Bulsara has pictures on the internet. I love showing the next picture of him growing up, and it's, of course, a picture of Freddie Mercury.
Sure.
And that...
the most famous export. Yeah.
Exactly. And that... it just always never fails to impress them. But through that personal narrative, whether it's my father or Farrokh, they really get a history of empire, how India, the Middle East, East Africa were this one contiguous geographical zone, of course, formed and shaped by empire. And I love to kind of raise this hypothetical scenario that the Bismillah in Bohemian Rhapsody could have been the words he might have heard my grandfather say from the mosque. But that really gives them a interesting history of why I went to study in Oxford. Was I could study there paying the home student prices because my father got British citizenship. And so I just like to say that because my grandfather fought the British, he ended up looking out for his grandson's education generations later, even though I never met the man. He looked out for my education generations later, allowing me to get my PhD from Oxford. But when I went to Oxford, it was trying to do this transnational history. At the end of the day, I focused on Iraq's history more than the history of East Africa. Even though for me, I knew when I was going to be a professor, I was going to show how all these areas were connected. But that's the reason I went to Oxford, why I focused on Iraqi history and really it's the Iraqi history that brings both my father's and my mother's side together. And I think that's why I chose that subject.
Interesting. Okay. And what has been your experience in terms of, so what is your research now focusing on?
So my research was on, the ability to do research on Iraq is always based on the primary sources you get access to. So in my day, there was maybe a few historians of Iraq, and they mostly worked on the British period. Juan Cole was one of them. But I was at an interesting juncture where documents from Saddam Hussein's Iraq, when I began my PhD in the year 2000, documents from Saddam Hussein's Iraq had just been made public for the first time. So I could write a history of Iraq in the 60s all the way to when they were captured, which was in the 1990s, the Gulf War. And so the most interesting part of this story is, and it even comes back to empire on another level. So I was making this joke about studying Iraq allowed me to connect to my grandfather's history. And in a bizarre, surreal episode, part of the research I was doing on Ba'athist Iraq in the year 2002 got plagiarized by the British government on the eve of the 2003 Iraq War. And the British government basically said, released something to the public called the latest intelligence dossier on Saddam Hussein's Iraq. And it's known as the Dodgy Dossier. And so this is how I came to do research on Iraq, and it came to produce the Dodgy Dossier. And it's a good lesson of the value of history, that the history I was doing on Iraq in 1991 in the year 2000 was just as valuable to the British government in justifying the 2003 Iraq War. And it was this document that was shown to the British Parliament where they voted to go to war against Iraq. Colin Powell took that document to the UN and, bandied it about its justification for the 2003 Iraq War. And of course, that war led to not only the invasion, but the birth of an insurgency.
Yeah.
And I really thought that was a good example of coming full circle. That the insurgency
Exactly right,
that my grandfather took part in set me on the path that indirectly justified another invasion of Iraq, where the British were back on Iraqi soil, and which produced an insurgency in the 21st century, which took, again, the British and Americans by surprise. But I always remember on the eve of 2003 Iraq War, using my grandfather as an example, don't be surprised if there was an insurgency emerging in 2003, I would say, based on my grandfather's story. And this is what I found, is telling history through personal narratives. Whether it's Freddie Mercury or my grandfather resonates a lot more than talking about, these trends in abstract terms.
Yeah, exactly.
Students resonate with the personal narrative.
Absolutely. So what did that teach you in terms of that experience, in terms of doing research, or sort of like how it can be misused as well?
Sure. Everyone always said that, research, the research you do could serve the powers that be.
Sure.
And I always thought, who would ever read this obscure thesis I'm doing in Oxford? But then, that case not only proved it, but it has a much more valuable lesson, is that people in the public should always be skeptical of the evidence. It's really a greater lesson on critical thinking, is when a government presents you with evidence saying this is the reason why we should go to war, now you should be more skeptical about those claims, whether it's in 2003 in Iraq or in 2025 when the U.S. attacked Iran, or when the U.S. is attacking Venezuela. Whenever evidence is saying, provided that this is intelligence that we have to ask, public should always be skeptical. That what is done in the name of intelligence reports are not these documents that have, absolute proof that the so-called threat is there.
You talked about part of your family. How about the other part?
That's a good. My mom's side of the family are from Iraq. They're, again, a prominent Twelver Shia family, with parts of their family originally coming from Kashmir.
Okay.
The Al-Kashmiri family, for example, is my side of my mom's family.
Oh, wow. Okay.
But the most interesting part of that side of the family, and I've published about this, is my grandfather married a woman who was a Syriac Orthodox Christian from Lebanon. And that side of the family, she died when my mother was very young, my grandmother. Okay, so tragically, both my grandmothers died in tragic circumstances, both related to the poor nature of public health, whether it was in East Africa or in my grandmother's case, in Iraq. And so that side of the family was never talked about, the Christian side of my family. And it was really, again, in the year 2000. And the year 2000 was a great discovery of my family's past. Was I went to Lebanon and more or less went into this city where I knew my grandmother was from, and just simply asked around, does anyone know a woman who married an Iraqi in the 1950s, an Iraqi Muslim in the 1950s, and was so scandalous that, people in this town called Zahli knew of my grandmother's story. And basically it was just by asking around, I found an entire side of my grandmother's family. And that there was my grandmother, and I won't give away this story because it's really a story that deserves its own. I found the Syriac Orthodox side of my family. Wow. And it's a very interesting interfaith story. Their side of the family was, I'm descendant, my grandmother's uncle would have been the patriarch of the Syriac Orthodox Church. So the equivalent of the Pope for this church. Yeah, that's a pretty big deal. So, and it was quite interesting that I learned a lot about Middle Eastern Christianity. And it was a great interfaith experience because for this side of the family, it didn't matter my religious difference. Right. They were always, I was their lost, relative. Right. And so it was not only a fascinating case where I could learn about this Christian side of my family. The Syriac patriarch, that's my great uncle, he's actually buried in Kerala, India. And again, it's another story of the British Empire. So in Kerala, India, of course, there's the largest concentration of Syriac Orthodox Christians. It's not in the Middle East, the St. Thomas Christians. Right, exactly. Yeah. And the British Empire asked them to go intervene in a doctrinal difference there. And the journey was so exhausting that he ended up dying, and he's buried in Kerala. And I went in to visit what was basically his shrine in India.
Wow.
I went, and it was a beautiful journey. And so, it's quite an interesting story about what the decline of what the decline of the Ottoman Empire meant for both sides of my family. For one grandfather, it was fighting the British, escaping to Zanzibar.
Right.
For the other side of the family, it was a great uncle who eventually was not only given a medal by the Ottoman Sultan, he was also recognized by Mustafa Kemal Ataturk. He was given a medal by him for keeping the Syriacs, more or less, I think, intact members of the new Turkish Republic.
Okay.
And eventually, so not only would my great uncle have met Ataturk, but then getting this request from the British Empire to mediate British India. And so both sides of the story are kind of like a microcosm of the Indian Ocean.
Right.
And this is why always my dream would be to have that perfect academic position. And you know how our disciplines are. The Middle East studies prevent us from doing West Indian Ocean studies and so on and so forth. But you see, these categories are really arbitrary.
Exactly.
And I just use my two sides of the family to demonstrate that the monsoon winds would explain a lot more of our region than these artificial geopolitical blocks would create.
That's right. Yeah. No, I mean, I think even like historically, culturally, there's just so much. I think that's the thing. People think, okay, well, people just kind of stayed where they were in the past, but there was actually a lot of movement. I mean, there's a lot of movement despite the technological hurdles.
Exactly. The steamship really, I mean, it's not an accident that Titanic did so well as a film because it tells these stories of these epic journeys that we take for granted, perilous epic journeys.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, the steamship, the steamboat was very much a story of my family.
Yeah.
And the railroads, of course. The British built railroads, of course. I mean, my father's family would have gone, they would have left Zanzibar through that north-south axis of the British Empire, so coveted in Africa.
Yeah. I mean, that was also very interesting just to think about how the empire stitched all these parts of the world together in very unique ways, right?
Well, I mean, the Gujaratis, whether we're talking about Zohran Mamdani's family, and it's quite interesting that I met Zohran.
Oh, really?
In a conference, and his father was at a conference in Istanbul.
Okay.
And so I knew the Mamdani last name, so I approached the father, and there was this was in the early 2000s, there was a young Zohran next to him.
So did they recognize who you were?
Mahmoud Mamdani did recognize my father, my grandfather, sorry. Oh, yeah, he absolutely recognized my grandfather when I told him who he was. And it's great just to have these academics, whether it's Mahmoud Mamdani or Faisal Devji, all know, not only my grandfather, but my family's majestic cinema in Zanzibar, that they're still involved in.
Right.
Yeah.
No, it's amazing. That's great. And so what, if you were able to design your ideal research project and you had as much money as you wanted to, what would you do?
Oh, it would be a research project taking these personal narratives and bringing them together in not only kind of written form, but using the new technology, whether it's artificial intelligence or multimedia, digital history, and more or less tell this story in a single cohesive narrative. I think the way academia is structured, we're not rewarded for these kind of projects.
That's right, exactly. Right.
Either it has to be Middle East studies or African studies, but this is really not only a story of interfaith. It's also a story of how the environment shaped us, but it's also a tragic story of how climate change is going to affect these areas we study. I mean, Zanzibar is already having problems with its mangroves and saltwater intrusion. And, whether we're talking about states like the Maldives or Seychelles, which were always stops on my grandfather's journey to India, we tend to forget this is about also preserving a place that is... locations that are also perilous going into the future. And so, that's why it's my ideal project. It's to bring attention to lands that are very much being threatened by climate change.
Okay. And this is a podcast that's also directed at students. So what advice do you have for students who maybe are interested in kind of pursuing Middle East studies or interested in kind of religious studies or interfaith work in the future, what should they do?
I have a great lesson for all of you, and it's study your passions. Don't give in too much to your parents' pressure. Now, because, I mean, for a good part of you, you're probably going to have connections to the region. And this is the other thing that unites our regions, whether I'm talking about South Asia, the Middle East, Africa, is we're always told to go into the hard sciences, law, medicine, engineering. And I really resisted that. And I'm glad I did, because, I mean, the ability to document these stories, to take my father to Zanzibar was all because I resisted their pressure. And so, you know, it's a very easy. Joseph Campbell, that one great scholar of mythology, always said, follow the bliss. I say, follow your passion. And if you have a question about what your passion is, again, I'll do a very academic exercise with you. Passion is coming from the Greek word that gives us pathos, where we get sympathy, empathy from, pathetic from. And it's also the other Greek word in another etymological direction that gives us passion. And so passion is not what we think about, like the telenovelas that you probably associate with South America. Passion literally means suffering. And if you think about it, you know, when you talk about the passion of Christ, you're not talking about Jesus Christ being a passionate dude. You're talking about somebody who's suffered. Right. And so if you have a trouble finding your passion, you know, ask yourself this: what is it without which in your life would you suffer? And if you have that answer, you have your passion, and I would say go ahead and pursue it. And ideally, you could pursue it academically. If not, you could do it, but you might not even know what your passion is unless you think about it in this term. And for me, the past was my passion, like because my family wouldn't tell it to me reliably. I always had to push them. I always had to push my father for stories about Zanzibar. I always had to tell my mom, tell me about the Lebanese side of the family that you're hiding, or tell me how bad it was in Iraq with the Mukhabarat, the secret police that sent you fleeing. And I never could get full comprehensive answers. I had to discover my past. And that became my passion, uncovering this past that was denied to me.
Okay, so it's a kind of a search for identity.
Yeah,
right?
Identity, yeah. I think all of us would suffer if we were denied our identity.
Of course, yeah.
And so I think that's a good way of saying, you know, always learn about your identity. And it's not, you know, for all of you, all students, no matter what, if you think your identity is boring, that, you know, I'm just a white guy from the U.S., no, because in every single one of my history class, this is my assignment. None of you have a boring history. You just haven't bothered looking. Or the way your parents told you it was boring. And so in my history courses, that's it. To graduate, that's something AI can't do for you.
Exactly.
Is you have to discover your past. How did the past make you?
That's wonderful. Yeah. No, I feel the same way in terms of being inspired by my own background in history. And I think that took me. And for me, it was also, I think, 9/11 also. I think in kind of I think that also kind of was a turning point in terms of like.
That's interesting. For me, it was the 9/11 Gulf War. When I was a teenager,
yeah.
And that's why I wrote my thesis on.
Right,
and 9/11, of course, was a turning point.
Yeah, it was a turning point. Yeah, exactly.
And that's kind of how I measure my life. It's pre 9/11, post 9/11.
Yeah, because you basically it was. I mean, I think growing up in like as a minority in the United States is definitely a search for identity. But then there are these catalyzing moments also that force you also to explain yourself. And to be able to explain yourself, you have to know who you are.
Exactly.
And there's this whole search that
That's
goes into
very true. You really do need to know your history to rebut arguments that Muslims are inherently terrorists or that Islam is inherently violent. And you really do need to go into the history and just show examples to, disprove those arguments.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, thank you so much,
Professor. My pleasure. I really enjoy you. Really good questions.
Wonderful, wonderful.
And I want to thank you for the work you're doing on my family, because I can't wait to learn from you about my family's past.
Of course, absolutely. Wonderful. Well, thank you so much.
My pleasure.
All right. Thank you.